I recently had a couple of stories from Scripture come up, which really reminded me of times when I went through really difficult seasons or difficult challenges. Obviously, I've been, being blown up, then going through severe mental health crisis, and also quite a lengthy divorce. And each time I was trying to do things on my own strength, which just made things worse until I got to a point where I I went back to the Lord, went back to faith, and it didn't immediately turn the situation around, but it gave me the strength and it gave me a peace in order to be able to deal with the situation, and then things did start changing. But ultimately, I still had to learn through the process in order to avoid certain those things from happening again. It's what makes us stronger, is the growth that we get through that. The Lord calls us to defy logic, and it's kind of like the thing that comes to me is like defy logic. It's like faith to defy logic, but it's also having a mindset that my God, our God, defies logic. What we see as logic isn't the same to Him. If you're the creator of the universe that spoke this very planet into existence, if you've got that amount of power, then the same rules that we live by doesn't abide to Him. And uh, and often what I found each time in these experiences is that He is just basically calling for that level of surrender, of handing over to Him, to have that faith that defies logic, where I look at the circumstance and I go, hang on, but this just does not make sense. But okay, God, I trust you. I'll just literally hand it over to you and see what happens. And Peter walking on the water was one. So Jesus just fed the 5,000, which again was a miracle in itself. Had people listening to him for days. They were getting hungry. It was getting late. So logic told the disciples that it's too late for the people to go back because of safety. Nobody had any money, so the disciples couldn't even just go off and buy some food, especially not for that amount of people. And then Jesus turned around and said, okay, well, what have we got? And this just goes to show that all we have to do is just show that little bit of faith. And again, this repeats itself when Peter walks on the water. It's just show that little bit of faith and He can multiply it. And Jesus obviously defied logic, multiplied all the food, and everybody ate. And there was still some left over. And then immediately after, He told the disciples to get into the boat and row across to the other side. It's almost like the perfect setup to test what they've just learned with the miracle of feeding the 5,000. So a storm brew was a headwind, according to John's account, was a headwind, and the disciples have been rowing. So they've been rowing now, and it was early in the morning. They were not getting anywhere, and they've been pretty much rowing all night, from what I can gather, because it wasn't until the fourth watch, which is generally between 3 and 6 a.m. in the morning, that Jesus then suddenly walks on the water towards them. And again, it defied logic because they thought it was a ghost. And then Peter, challenged Jesus, and he said, well, Jesus, if that's really you, then tell me to step out of the boat. And often when we're in a storm of our own and we're getting, thrown here, there, and everywhere, we seem like we're not getting anywhere because we're trying to do things on our own strength. Jesus is there. There might be a glimpse of Him being there. And this is where we have a choice to make. It's like, well, you can either carry on in your own strength, or you could just turn to Him and see what He does. And when you turn to Him, the Bible says when He invites you, He does not discard you. But you have to then turn and go to Him. And this is exactly the case here. Peter turns to Him, asks Him to tell him to get out onto the water if it's really Him. And He said, okay, well, come on then. If you want to do that, let's do it. And again, for Peter, this would have defied logic, because I can just imagine that being in that position where you're looking at the sea and you think, well, logic tells you that, well, as soon as I can't stand on water, I can maybe swim, but there's a massive storm and a wind, so I'm likely to drown. This just does not make sense. But he gets out of the boat anyway, and he shows that little bit of faith, and then he walks towards Jesus. And it wasn't until he got close to Jesus that he saw the storm, he saw the waves, the wind, and that's when he doubted, and that's when he sank. And this is crucial, because he then cries out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus grabbed him, pulled him out of the water, put him in the boat, and then Jesus told the storm to be still, and it was still straight away, which terrified all the other disciples. Now, the lesson to learn from that for me was, well, actually, yes, he showed that faith. But obviously, when you're in a storm, regardless of what it is you're dealing with, whether it's addiction, whether it's obviously divorce, whether it's something else traumatic, whatever, it's always trying to distract you. The enemy is trying to distract you because it doesn't want you to get through the situation. So we can often, most of us will be overwhelmed by what's going on. And Jesus actually asked the question in the boat. He doesn't rebuke Peter, but he just asks him, like, why did you doubt? You had it. You were walking on the water. Why did you doubt? But it's more out of a learning moment for all of them. And to me, in that scenario, it's like, I doubted because I became distracted by my situation. Rather than focusing on you, Lord, I became distracted by all of this, and I became overwhelmed with the threat of the situation. But also the good thing is that obviously Jesus calmed the storm, and it goes to show that he doesn't let us stay in these storms for longer than what's needed. He's not cruel. He'll allow us to be in a storm for until we've learned what we need to learn, until we are where we need to be, and then he'll turn it around. The other example was in Exodus 14, where the Israelis have been walking in the desert for weeks, and they are now between the mountain and the Red Sea. The Egyptians were pursuing them, and they basically were at a point where it's either going back to slavery or they're all going to be massacred. They could not see, logically, they could not see a solution to that, because to them, they wouldn't think about going through the sea. Like, why would you, as a human being? And they cried out to the Lord, and God just basically said, it shows his sense of humor. It's like, what are you crying about? Just go through the sea, basically. But he told him to be still. And he told Moses to obviously just go through the sea. Like it's nothing, but of course, it's nothing for him. And he's encouraging us to have that faith, to look at the situation and go, right, I don't see a way out of this, but I know you can make a way, God. Please do that. And obviously we know that, Moses used his staff, the water was parted, and they went through on dry land to the other side. And it's just moments like this that just goes to show that, one thing is that sometimes the Lord will allow a certain circumstance or situation for not just for our benefit. Yes, we're the ones going through that, and we're potentially in the middle of the storm. But God makes it clear that, he is doing this so that the Egyptians, who are like weeks behind in distance, would know that he is Lord. And the same thing with Peter in walking on the waters. The disciples saw what was happening, and they also learned the lesson. So it wasn't just for Peter's sake, it's also for their sake. It wasn't just for the Israelis' sake, it was also for the Egyptians, so that they know who God is and that they can turn to God. So sometimes these things will happen in a certain way so that the people around us could also benefit or also learn from this. But the other thing is that we always have a choice to make. I only had a choice to make. I can either try and keep doing it under my own strength, or I can just hand it over to the Lord and just trust him and just try my hardest in each moment to trust him. But then when I do fail, or when I do make a mistake, or when I try and do things in my own strength again because I panic and suddenly become distracted, the examples both with Moses and with Peter showed that we can just cry out to him and he will help us. Because Peter easily could have tried to swim back under his own strength, but he didn't. He cried out to God. He cried out to Jesus straight away. And that's what we're doing. Thirdly, it's just not to give up, because we just don't know. We just don't know when God's going to move. The guys were rowing for how long, and then suddenly Jesus turned up in a way that they did not expect. Moses and those guys, they were next to the sea for how long, and then suddenly God showed up and showed them the way. So really the lesson from this for me was just to put your trust in the Lord, just keep choosing to focus on him. And when we make a mistake, don't sweat it too much. Just turn to him and just give him a chance to sort things out, and just don't give up, because you just don't know when it's going to turn around. Thanks for watching. Please give it a like if it was useful, leave a comment, share with someone who could do with this message, and subscribe to be kept up to date with more content.